Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode 321 of Stu and the Nunn. You got Stu here. Nunn is still down running his phenomenal red rum sport fishing business in Cabo San Lucas, having just survived another hurricane hit last weekend. So he is very busy down there and still can't join us. But I am joined by my newly made good friend through mutual contacts, Mr. Cameron Hamilton, who is running for the Virginia 7, District 7 in the state of Virginia. Cameron, I want to thank you so much for joining me, and I am really looking forward to this interview.
Yeah, Morton, thanks for having me.
Yes, awesome. So, hey man, we are big supporters here. We have had over our years on this running this show, so many vets running for political office. What I've said to a lot of them is, hey, when you're in the military, you don't get paid to have an opinion, right? You get your orders, they're lawful, they're what you get told to do, and you march toward that objective. You don't get to question why or this kind of stuff, right? But I think it's awesome when we retire and some of us grow beards and we do all that kind of stuff, and then we're like, hey, I've earned a right to this opinion and I can now express it. And even better is I can start to give back through my community, whether it's through some kind of civil service of politics or a local law enforcement or first responder. And to me, that's just awesome when someone already checks the block, gives their part to the country and says, I'm not done yet, and keeps on giving. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you.
So obviously you're our military. I mentioned that. So why don't we open up with you going in your background a little bit, letting our viewers and listeners know kind of who you are,
Okay.
where you came from, and then who you are.
Absolutely. So I grew up in Northern California, a little place called Sonoma County, and California was a very different animal back in the day. I think back in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of the peace, love, and hippie movement that came through there, but most people who identified as Republicans in California were kind of they were more libertarian focused, sort of a live and let live. That was a lot of the mantra of that state. And that's very much the climate I grew up in. You don't have to ask people to agree with you, but just treat everyone decently and be civil. And so we were old school, just kind of libertarian Reagan Republicans, if you will. Growing up, I was really active in sports. I did a lot of competitive wrestling, did grappling, jujitsu, and other martial arts, and also played competitive soccer, had an opportunity to play competitive soccer on an amateur team overseas. And ultimately, one thing I couldn't shake was this unwavering sense of service. I needed to serve in the United States military. I didn't know how, didn't know what, but I knew that I needed to serve and give back to this country that I thought had given me so much and every opportunity in the world. As a high school kid, I will say I had several opportunities to go overseas on different trips and see some of the depravity of more primitive parts of the world. And it gives you a great sense of gratitude for what we have here and the uniqueness of this nation. So after high school, during high school, actually, I enlisted in the delayed entry program for the U.S. Navy. My father was in the Air Force. He served as a personnelman during the Vietnam War, and both my grandfathers served in the Navy. They were Seabees, construction battalions. Old John Wayne's CB Can Do. So they actually both served in the Pacific, building CHUs, building runways, building barracks, building dining facilities for Marines that were going from island to island, setting up operations. Really remarkable job. So very much service has been a part of my family. And I'm a fourth generation service member. Again, it goes all the way back to my great grandfather. And we even have records going back to the Camerons and the Hamiltons coming before that. Specifically, the Camerons came over during the time of the Civil War from Scotland and decided to fight for the North. I'm in Virginia, so that's a hot topic for some. But either way, so service has always been a part of my family, and I knew it's what I wanted to do. I had an opportunity to join the Navy. I chose to become a SEAL and to be a medic. So I went to Corps School up in Great Lakes, Illinois, and then went to basic underwater demolition SEAL training, class 261, made it straight through with no recycles in BUDS. Then that went into SQT, got my Trident, reported to Fort Bragg, North Carolina for medical training at the schoolhouse down there, the Joint Special Operations Medical Training Center. That's where we have a lot of the Green Beret medics and the Ranger medics, the civil affairs medics. We
PJs, all those guys.
Well, the PJs had just separated a couple of years prior.
Oh, they did? So I didn't know.
2003 or 4, I believe. So we were just after that iteration. They had their own schoolhouse. But before that, yes, they would come to that same schoolhouse. And Force Recon Corpsman, you name it. So I went there as a SEAL graduate with my Trident, became a medic, went through the long course, the SOIDC course, which is the equivalent of the latter half of the course, the 18 Delta course that's traditionally only reserved for senior medics, and then reported to SEAL Team 8. While at SEAL Team 8, I deployed 4 times, 2 to Afghanistan, 2 in support of OEF, and then really just traveled all throughout, came back to Fort Bragg, North Carolina as an instructor. When I was there as a student, I met my wife. I stole the best thing out of Fayetteville, North Carolina, brought her with me to Virginia Beach, and then came back, which was a good R&R time. Was an instructor there for about 4 years, and then ultimately I had an injury coupled with kind of an opportunity to work at the State Department. So I worked at the State Department for about 5 years under what we called Project Guardian. That's within the Directorate of Operational Medicine. Think of it as a repurposing of an 18 Delta type individual for diplomatic affairs overseas in places like Yemen, like Somalia, like Libya, you name it. That was the mission set that I signed up for. Places where there's really limited infrastructure, but personal protection coupled with medical provision is integral. So protecting ambassadors, protecting dignitaries, congressional delegations, things along those lines. I actually left the Department of State in 2020, right when the pandemic had started, and came over to DHS. Some of my last days at DOS was actually coordinating the Wuhan flights, the first one that came back, bringing all the Americans from Wuhan, China into the United States, into California and then further over. Very interesting time. Worked at DHS as a division director for emergency medical services, overseeing standards of about 4,000 EMTs, all scattered throughout the Department of Homeland Security. These are principally law enforcement officers that are also EMT qualified.
Right.
And then over time, I will say, I don't want to, give the spoiler. My campaign video probably summarizes it pretty well, but essentially over time, the more and more I worked in government, the more and more I became exposed to some of what I call the bureaucratic sickness of government. I became exceedingly frustrated at seeing the resources being squandered of this nation haphazardly, and fiscal irresponsibility, as well as practices that are completely not in the best interests of the American taxpayer. So ultimately, a good friend of mine, Nick Freitas, who is a state delegate here in Virginia, he's actually my delegate. Nick approached me. Nick had said, look, we've been praying for someone like you to run for a long time, and I really think you should give this a good consider, which is ironic because God had been putting this on my heart for quite a while. So there's lots of other things that occurred, but the long story short is through successive layers of confirmation and prayer, it became abundantly clear that this was the next pathway and the next hilltop I needed to advance to, so to speak. So
yeah, that's interesting. Obviously, you took right in one of my next questions. Was did you ever what was the tipping point? I'm glad to hear it was God was putting it on your heart and you listened to him. I mean, is probably the initiator, the trigger of that, and then other folks. But also, sadly, seeing some of the ineptness and probably fraud, waste, and abuse and everything else of that you saw in the federal government, I'm sure was just something like, I can't let this stand. Was it just it sounds like from your upbringing on, it was just that core part of your DNA was like, I just can't sit back and do nothing and watch and complain about this.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
It's hard to describe that characteristic until you meet people who just have it. And so I'd like to think that that's part of the intrinsic nature that God gives to certain kinds of warriors, just this calling, this sense of virtue in wanting to restore something that's greater than yourself. And so I love this country. I believe that this is, the greatest nation on the face of the earth. And with the freedoms and the liberties and the foundation, so unique in how the American Revolution was all about restoring justice, the restoration and affirmation of appropriate justice defended by biblical reasoning and precepts, whereas many other revolutions that you found within our counterparts of Europe, like France and others, was very much class warfare. It was very much usurping and completely flipping the political spectrum on its head because of perceived grievances, and that the system of government itself was inherently unjust, whereas in the United States it was very different. We believed in restoring the appropriate justice that the king and ultimately Parliament had infringed upon, self-governance, things along those lines. So really unique, very, very.
I mean, the writings
See.
of Thomas Paine, right? I mean,
Yep.
that's what we're talking about.
Yep.
So
Exactly.
let me ask you real quick. I mean, to catch up, but I want to kind of capture on that for a second. When you look at where we are today as a country, and you look at where our country was birthed from and how we came together of what we left, we're pretty much how the articles of our Constitution and everything were put. We all, I'm sure you and I share the same view of why they were, the amendments were written the way they were. What is your thoughts when you look at where we are today, go back to 1776, and you go back to how this country started before that, and the similarities or differences?
There are definitely similarities. I think what we see now, at least at that time, you had a lot more intent for states to check and balance federal powers and federal oversight. The United States, when it was formed into an early nation, was not homogenous in its political philosophy about what was the role of a federal government, what was the role of state government, who had what authority and power, could it be removed, could it be rescinded, was it temporary, was it permanent? These were all really complex arguments that were being debated in a novel way here in this nation. You can read about it in the Federalist Papers. You can also read about it later on in some of the Congressional House files that you find, with all these different compelling ideas about what this country would look like. But one thing I will say that we have found is, over time, the Republican arguments of the day, the Jeffersonians, the Monroes, the Madisons, and many others, were very concerned about the expansion of federal powers so as to completely override the authorities of state autonomy.
Do you feel that's happened? Do you feel that's happened a lot?
Absolutely, in many respects. I mean, we see the EPA versus West Virginia, a recent Supreme Court case. That's a prime example of a regulatory agency that was not given specific, appropriated, or even enumerated powers in Congress to then execute its oversight of a law or a legal action that a state declared was unconstitutional and was within their jurisdiction and sovereignty. We need, so to hit that thread a little bit more, in the Founders' Day, states very much reserved the rights of autonomy. Mm-hmm. And the 10th Amendment had particular emphasis. It was not put there haphazardly. It was very intentional. And the coalition of states was not completely unified. It was a very thin balance that was held. And many states threatened to completely remove themselves from this federation if the 10th Amendment, as well as other provisions, were not placed therein. And so the point being, now what we see is the federal government has become so massive and so intrusive in a variety of different characteristics of our daily lives, and the authority of state and local governments has really suppressed. It's really it's been removed from the authority that it should have. So I think we are at a point where jurisdictionally and politically, we have an imbalance. We have a significant imbalance where the federal government has become exceedingly large and intrusive in the daily lives of Americans, whereas the state and local government has not. Now, the answer is not just simply, well, elevate the state government. Yeah, but this isn't necessarily a zero-sum game, but you do have to suppress activities of the federal as well. So it's this seesaw teetering effect, and we have to find that sweet balance. So in my opinion, I think examples like what we saw with EPA versus West Virginia is one of many examples that we should see more of. If states believe that the federal government has engaged in activities that it's not clearly defined they have the authority to be, states should aggressively challenge those efforts, aggressively. And so that's kind of to break down my philosophy of what politics should be. I believe in the elevation of state and local authorities, because why? Well, they set your local taxes, your board of supervisors, your school boards, your local sheriff, your state legislature, your state laws. We've withdrawn a lot of those and put heavy emphasis on Congress because it's good and it's show-worthy, it's controversial, they're loud, they're well-funded, but it's not where the appropriate emphasis should be. People should care more about what's going on within their state and jurisdiction than they should what's going on at the federal level. And
you would think after the 2020 election that people would realize how important state and local elections are, right? All the way down to your local town board,
Yep.
or whatever represents your local area. Because I mean, obviously we saw laws changed and things
Yep.
done overnight and all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
That, you know, and I've said this a few times, that if you want to get involved with politics, if you want to have an opinion and be out there and be loud, you should start literally down at your school board and work your way up from there, right?
Absolutely.
Now, when you talk about this imbalance of power, interesting you mentioned that, because it's something I've talked about a number of times. Is, you know, obviously there's a number of ways you could look at how the federal government has done it via whether, you know, highway laws, you know, or school or things that they want done in states. It's all about the power of the purse, right? They withhold funds or give funds. You know, if we want you to have your speed limit at this, or we're not going to give you highway funds. We want you to do this, get rid of these programs in your schools, or we're not going to give you those funds. It's almost, to me, that imbalance of power has become, is largely contributed to states and lower local governments being on the government teat and being so dependent on the government that they are beholden to. I mean, to me, it's like extortion, right? I mean, look at how gun laws are enforced not through anything that's provided in the Constitution, but through interstate commerce, right? That's they regulate, mandate. I mean, that's why some states have, like Texas and Montana or Wyoming, have, you know, made guns and built guns in their states. They sell to their citizens and say, federal laws don't apply to us because we're not allowing them to be sold or transported over state lines. But the government regulates guns pretty much through interstate commerce law, because that's what's guaranteed by or what's called for in the Constitution. So to me, it seems like the state and local governments have allowed this to happen because they've gotten they're on the smack. They can't get off the smack.
Yep. Yeah, no, you're spot on. And that's the thing that sucks about culpability, is we have to really take a good look in the mirror and realize, oh, this sucks. Yeah, but we're partially responsible ourselves for this environment, the difference is, when we know that, when we realize that, there can be empowerment there. Okay, so let's get off our rear ends and fix it then.
Right.
A lot of times we placate about, you know, complaining about government and this and that. You know, it's so terrible, it's so corrupt. There's things going on where it shouldn't belong, and we've got this, you know, kind of, you know, priorities that are totally out of balance, that aren't serving the American people. We've done this. We've done this because of the people we've sent to DC. We've done this because we've not been as active in our state and local government as we should be. We've done this because we don't have people going to school board meetings, town council meetings, board of supervisor meetings the way that they should be. So you know, we have really good, amazing, patriotic, God-fearing people in this country, but when they don't show up to some of these local events, what do you expect to happen? The enemy's going to gain ground. And so think of it like a battlefield. I hate to say it that way, but it's true.
Right.
We need to be civically engaged. And so, all things being said, what I think is going on right now, we are at a very delicate point where we potentially can correct course, but it requires a lot of investment. And so it's really funny you mentioned interstate commerce clause. That's a prime example of broad sweeping legislative action that gives the federal government almost unfettered jurisdiction. It's really, I mean, and there's some legitimate concerns about it too. You start rationing supplies during a world war.
Or a pandemic.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. So at least the founders back in the day understood that there may be good things that can come from expanded federal powers, but there's a lot of bad too.
Well, when you think about back then, you know, interstate commerce was, you know, not a common thing, right? Things were, you know, it was just the nature of our country at that stage, right? Things were grown and built and stuff. And it was like, you know, again, it was almost like an international commerce. I think, in my opinion, I think it was thought of like we do today. Think of international commerce. It was like, hey, one state's going to sell and trade over to another one and back and forth, and they don't want people to jack prices up. So I think that's why the founding fathers put that in there. But today, obviously,
there were tariff wars.
There
were tariff wars early on with the American colonies.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That were really legitimate. New York was one of the biggest offenders of them.
Yeah. So it is, you know, to think of it today, we're a global economy, and that no one even thinks about that. Right. But again, like you said, broad sweeping use of that to do that. You sound very much like a constitutional or libertarian conservative, or so-called constitutional libertarian. Would you kind of classify yourself that way? I mean, you talked about being a Reagan libertarian, but you're hitting on 10th Amendment, which is big to me. I mean, and it sounds like you're definitely for smaller government.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And that kind of stuff. So
I like to think of myself, because I've been asked, you know, who's your ideal legislator? I'm like, well, okay, look, I'll be transparent. The more I've gotten to know about certain people of Congress, the less respect I've had for them. Because you see people on TV, you're like, wow, this guy's amazing. This lady's unbelievable. And then you find out who they really are and you go, oh, this is gross. Okay.
Yeah.
Like, so I will say there's been some kind of, I won't call it hero worship, but there's been some people that I thought were amazing that I found out their personal lives and I realized, oh, wow, that is incredibly underwhelming or disappointing. Having said that, I'd like to say that I line up very similar to like a Thomas Massey, Rand Paul, Ronald Reagan, this like interesting merger of all these different characteristics. There's a lot of great legislators. You know, Bob Good has been doing some amazing stuff recently. Eli Crane, I'm a huge fan of Eli Crane, but I also like, you know, some of the decency that you find with many other more moderate members of Congress, with how they have good decorum. They're humble, and so it's, I guess my ideal form of legislator would be fierce like a lion, but charismatic like Reagan. You know,
Right.
like a Southern cowboy. You know, that's what we need more of. We need that Southern gentleman kind of persona to come back and to be decent, to be good. That doesn't mean compromising. It just means being good to others, showing our faith, showing the goodness that God has given mankind when we're appropriately governed and walking in the ethics that He gives us, and in His, and defining our character by His ways. So this is where I get into the argument of, I am very much a constitutional conservative. I'm a limited government constitutional conservative, believing that the federal government has exceeded its authorities, has gone into a variety of areas that are unchecked. And it's one thing particularly that I get really irked about is executive agencies and or departments which have regulatory authority not explicitly defined either in the Constitution or through appropriations. My concern about bills, for example, government organization X shall create a program that shall do X, Y, and Z, and it shall have this much budget and this much time to do it. That's it. You don't see the specifics of, okay, well, what's that program achieving?
Right.
By launching a new program, a new, like, so let's say that the Department of Justice, they have this new program they want to use for managing content online, right? Congress needs to very specifically define what's the end state objective with this bill, not just, hey, we're going to give you money for this project that kind of does these things, sort of, and here's the time frame you have to deal with it, and we'll figure out whether or not this is going to be a lasting authority. That's a huge blank check.
Right.
Not only that, but we give so much deference to the executive branch of our government on execution and on their interpretation of legislative action that is completely unbalanced.
And we've seen where they have went against the Constitution and no one holds them accountable.
And you rarely see states or local authorities coming back requesting before a magistrate or a judge saying, no, you've exceeded your constitutionally granted authorities here. Now, there's a couple of unique circumstances where those powers have been appropriately checked. For example, I signed on with Feds for Med Freedom when the vaccine mandate had come out against a lot of federal employees. So Executive Order, 14043 by the president, mandating that all federal employees had to be vaccinated against SARS-CoV-2. That was appealed to the Fifth Circuit. A Fifth Circuit judge ruled it was unconstitutional, the order. An appeals court overruled the initial judge. Then an en banc ruling overruled the appeals court, said, no, this does exceed executive authority. And that was the big argument. Did Congress grant the President of the United States or the executive branch of government the authority to execute oversight of certain personal health decisions? Did they actually have that authority constitutionally? The argument was no. Can they? Well, that's very subjective, but no, they were never granted the authority to execute that. Now, this is where it got sticky, because the DOD, and specifically the Secretary of Defense, does have different authorities that not other federal agencies have. He does have the authority of oversight for the physical readiness of service members. So that argument, as it pertains towards service members in the vaccine mandate, unfortunately had to take a different pathway. Congress intervened, though. What did they do? They stripped that language from the appropriation bill and threatened to withhold funding if they continued to enforce the mandate. That was exactly what the founders would have wanted.
Yeah.
The founders would have said, aha, You saw an area where the executive branch in some manner was exploiting a
And
loophole.
they checked and balanced them.
Exactly.
Which has been
So they
rarely
threatened to
done since
withhold funds.
2008.
Yep.
Really, since 2008 has been
Yep.
rarely done. That's
Yep.
I've talked about. We have not had 3 branches of government. It has pretty much been 2, because Congress in whole, regardless of who's in charge, even when there was a mandate on one side or the other,
Yep.
has just not kept the executive branch in check.
Right. And ironically, that Fifth Circuit case that I was talking about with Feds for Med Freedom, now it's Feds for Freedom, that was appealed by DOJ to the Supreme Court.
Which falls under the executive.
So that case from 2020 is still ongoing with litigation.
Yeah. Hey, so I want to keep. So let's talk about the District 7.
Yeah.
It's a swing district. I guess the incumbent there, she is looking to possibly run for governorship because of Virginia. The Commonwealth has term limits of 2, which is awesome. We'll talk more about term limits another time for sure. But
just so that we're clear, I've signed the term limits pledge.
Oh, I know you have. I want to talk. I'm definitely going to hit on that.
Yep.
What do you think your chances are? Are you facing other conservatives in that race? I mean, obviously that's reaching up north of Culpeper in that area. You're right at the edge of Fairfax. Probably includes some of Fairfax. But what do you think your chances are there?
I think my chances are very good. Everywhere we've gone, we've gotten great receptions. I think the people are hungry for constitutional conservatism, especially with what's going on now, and also fiscal responsibility. The 3 main platforms that I'm running on that I talk to people about is, number 1, we have to engage in better, more secure fiscal practices. Number 2, we have to maintain appropriate oversight of federal and executive actions so as to check and potentially eliminate fraud, waste, and unjustified actions that are at the expense of the American people. Number 3, we have to secure the southern border. Ironically, all 3 of those topics I have worked extensively within. And so there's a variety of other topics as well. Everywhere we go, people are hungry for that. People just want the federal government off their back. People are sick and tired of taxes coming up. And I also, to be honest here, people are also sick and tired of donating to conservative causes, feeling like they're getting targeted by the IRS or by the DOJ or by many other entities. This is a very prevalent. Sorry, I got a train going by.
It's all good.
I don't know if you can hear it. My
that's interstate commerce working its thing. That's all.
Yep,
right.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. But people are exceedingly frustrated at what seems like a federal government and a federal bureaucracy that doesn't serve them. Yeah. It's very much at their expense. So this district is a D+1. It's classified that because of some recent polling, but we have to remember Governor Youngkin won this district when he ran for governor in 2021. Now Trump lost this district by a few 8 points, I believe. But Governor Youngkin won by a larger margin. So that's optimistic. Number 2, this is a seat that's been held by Republicans and conservatives for a long time. And especially not only that, but constitutional conservatives. We had Eric Cantor for quite a while. He was unseated by David Bratt. After David Bratt, we had Nick Freitas, who ran in 2020. He didn't win, but he's a strong constitutional conservative, and he's actually my campaign chair and has endorsed me. Then we had Yesley Vega, strong constitutional conservative, limited government conservative. And so people are hungry for a new kind of Republican to come and represent this district in a real and tangible way, but also with goodness and decency. So the district encompasses Greene, Madison, Culpeper, Orange, Spotsylvania, Fredericksburg, Caroline, King George, Stafford, and the eastern half of Prince William. And there's also a sliver of Albemarle down just north of Charlottesville. I think it's 20 houses or something along those lines. 17 houses, I think, is actually what it is. So it's a really broad kind of coalition of rural with suburban environments. It shows quite a bit.
Is the suburban very left-leaning, you think, or typically, and is it still today?
So it's definitely on the moderate element. I'll put it that way. Stafford still leans Republican, but it's definitely moderate for sure.
Are schools still an issue in Virginia? I mean, Youngkin really won in the schools thing. Okay. You don't hear, obviously you don't hear about it in the news. There's a lot of other stuff in the news, but back when Youngkin was running and everything, we saw parents getting arrested and yanked out of school board meetings and all that kind of stuff. And I kind of, my personal opinion was that was a big reason why, he won. And I was just wondering if that's still a hot topic.
It absolutely is. It 100% is. And that's where I'm running for a congressional seat. There are limited powers and authorities that the Congress has over education. But I will say what I would love to see the Department of Education reformed into is instead a consortium of state representatives, their educational representatives, where the federal government's sole purpose is really to be facilitators. Hey, we're just going to arrange for quarterly meetings, monthly meetings. The federal government shouldn't have any actual executing authority over education, in my opinion. Instead, we should lead a coalition of states that partner together. Let Oklahoma talk to Colorado, talk to Alaska, talk to Texas, talk to Mississippi. Let the states work out their standardized ethics and practices and learn from one another. Let the federal government just be in the role of taking notes, ensuring everyone can attend meetings,
and facilitating.
Exactly that.
Yeah, not just working with the NEA president,
exactly,
and the union, not
exactly
getting away from that.
We should be facilitators of appropriately working state educational programs, and so that's where Oklahoma is very different than Alaska, and it's very different than California. We should expect their state educational profiles to adapt their practices appropriately. That's also a big incentive for kind of enhancing. If you have a state that has really sound educational practices, what's that going to do? You're going to drive tourism. You're going to drive people to move there. People are going to want to come there because they want their kids to succeed.
You know, like I do, when people have a family and they're looking to move, there's, you know, they go look at that new area, right? They're looking at the education. They're looking at crime. They're looking at job opportunities. Obviously, you know, what the housing market looks like.
Real estate too. Yep.
Right. Exactly. But education is always one. When I moved, everywhere we moved, it's been like, what are the schools like? You know, where do they rank? All that kind of stuff. You're obviously trying to place your kids in a good place to be, you know, grow and become smart. So that's awesome. I mean, that's it sounds like you share a lot of the same beliefs and fundamentals as Governor Youngkin, so that should definitely contribute to you doing very well. Now, this election is next November, right? This is the one that's
correct.
Yeah.
So I have a primary in June of 2024, and then a general election. If we win the primary, which I believe we can and we will, then the general election will be in November of 2024.
How many other candidates have their name in on this right now?
Right now, we have 6, I believe, for my primary. So it's probably going to get a bit more crowded. Now that the incumbent is likely not to run for re-election, everyone under the sun feels led to run for Congress.
Right.
So it's going to get a little more crowded, most likely. That being said, I'm running as the constitutional conservative candidate. I'm running very much as the Freedom Caucus style candidate that believes in limiting federal government intrusion, cutting spending dramatically, and just pushing the federal government back into its original intent and role, and elevating the authority and autonomy of state and local governments. So I think I'm pretty much, we'll see how the primary plays out. There's possibility that we have more that join. But either way, you know, this isn't about me versus the other primary opponents. This is about us giving a compelling message for what the people of Virginia 7 need. And what they need is something a heck of a lot better than what they've been getting.
Right. Did you ever, I mean, we talked about your upbringing and your background and kind of what led you to this, but when you were younger, when you weren't thinking about, I want to be a fireman or a Navy SEAL or an astronaut, did you ever think that you may be in politics? Was there anyone in high school that said, man, you argue great, you should be a lawyer or in politics? I mean, anything like that? Did you ever have an inclination at all, your parents or anyone to say, this kid's going to be in politics? Well, he's going to be, you know, up there one day.
Yes. The long story short is yes. One of my best friends, his father used to actually say this over me and him, that one day he thought I was going to be in the House of Representatives, which when you hear at 13, you're like, okay, I have no interest in doing that whatsoever. But it is kind of funny how God has a sense of humor, I think. So yes, I've had quite a few people along the way that have told me that they believe that that God has a unique purpose for me. That might sound arrogant. I don't mean to say it that way in any way. I want to be of service.
He has purposes for all of us, right? We just got to we just got to listen to him and pay attention when he tells us.
My role and my ultimate objective in this is to be of service to my maker as best I can. And then secondarily, to be a defender of common action for the people that are here within my district that I'm seeking to represent. We need selfless leaders. We need servant leaders to come back into the forefront. We need leaders who are willing to sacrifice so much of their comfort and their time and their stability. And that's exactly what I've done. I believe I've been called to do this, not because it's my job, but because I see service as an honor. And I have seen so many people working in government, acting as representatives or senators or public officials that have no idea about the implications of their decisions and how it impacts others. And I can't sit by and watch it anymore. I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a Christian. Those things will stay with me no matter what. The only way we fix government is by putting people in power with better character. That's the only way this fixes. The answer to bad government is not less government. Less government, but still bad, can be just as destructive.
Yeah.
And so the argument here is we need to put people in power who have better character, stronger resolve, who say and do what they mean, who actually fulfill promises that they make. That's the only way we fix this problem. So that's the path that God has me on right now. I firmly believe that. I believe that we're going to triumph. I believe that we're going to represent this district very well, but it will absolutely be an uphill battle. I have no illusions about that whatsoever.
Well,
I'm not in this.
you've fought a lot of battles in your time. I know.
Well, that's true.
Both
I'm definitely
literally
not an
and figuratively.
establishment type candidate.
Yeah.
And so I've already been making a few enemies, which is unfortunate, but it's reality. I will say, though, one of the unique things that's missing from a lot of politics is just decency and humility.
Right.
So we're willing to fight. We're willing to fight like lions, but we're also willing to be humble. And we need legislators who have and embrace that humility to truly represent the people. And so that's what I believe I'm called to do.
You and I share a lot of the same facets, because I was going to mention earlier was, obviously you're a great leader, been that in the military and probably a lot of other aspects in civilian service. But, I've always said one of the most overlooked traits of a good leader is humility and humbleness, right? I tell people, no one can argue that Jesus Christ was the greatest leader of all time. And this was a guy that got down and washed the feet of those that followed him. If that's not a sign of humility, right? And it sounds like from some of your earlier comments, I mean, you share that same thing, is you got to be humble. That's what people look at. People, it's too easy to find someone that is a hypocrite. I mean, too many people put stuff on social media. You can find them being a hypocrite. Like you said, there were people that you admired and elected reps, and then you learn more about them, right? But leaders that exude humility and are humble, but still are focused on what they're leading towards, I think are much more effective. And in today's time, I think people are waking up and looking at that, whether they know they're looking at that trait or not. So
people are hungry for it. Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah.
I will say with humility, the only way we can be humble, the only way we can properly express humility is when we have gratitude.
Yeah.
And so when we live in a culture and a society now that inculcates you with selfishness and all these terrible and destructive practices, it's no wonder we have a lack of humility, because no one's grateful for what they have.
Right. They almost expect it, right?
Exactly. And so we have this entitlement era. We saw it in the SEAL teams. It was the weirdest thing. It was my generation of frogmen that came into the SEAL teams that started to have a very different perspective. We felt like we were entitled. We felt like, and I will say, as a younger man, I was guilty of some of that. And I needed to have kind of my face smashed, and I needed to have my ego checked really early on by people who said, look, you got to serve and do your time here. You got to be willing to put some scars on the body before you have any standing, and before, we're going to give you that kind of autonomy that you're seeking here. You got to show that you're able to do the job. And I think people need to focus more on kind of doing the work, getting down to business. Stop complaining. Let's get to work. If you don't, and so there's a book that I love. It's called As a Man Thinketh. It's written by a man named Allen. Remarkable book. It's one of the few books I keep extra copies on my shelf, just because if I have a great conversation, here, take this book, changed my life. Amazing. I mean, not as much as the Bible, of course, but it's a great book about human culpability. And Allen talks extensively about, if you don't like the circumstances you're in, what are you doing and endeavoring to fix it with? Right. And if you're not, you deserve to remain exactly where you are. And he's harsh with some of his criticism, but man, it is a breath of fresh air when you realize every human being has worth in the sight of our Maker. Every human being has capability in ways that are unique. Now, there are people born with abnormalities. I wasn't born colorblind. A friend of mine was, who tried to go to BUD/S and become a SEAL. His father was an old UDT from back in the day. That sucks. He was disqualified and could never join the SEAL teams. That's the lot he was dealt. But you know what he didn't do? He didn't complain about it. He didn't say, woe is me. He didn't throw his arms in the air. He fought like hell to get a waiver. He was not granted a waiver. This is not a waiverable condition by the military.
Right.
So he picked up and he did something else. And he found another way to serve. And he did it with a smile on his face, grateful for the opportunity. that kind of resolve, that kind of strength of character is what we desperately need more of. And it's funny because we need that in DC, because DC should be a reflection of the people that they serve. And so on my
Right.
website, I said our government should reflect the character of the people we of our representatives. And the
Right.
ultimate point there is, if we elect people with poor character, what do we expect? We should
Right.
expect poor results.
And that poor character, just like, they say, you're a reflection of the people you hang around with, right?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
you elect someone like that up there. That's a reflection of their constituents. Like,
Yeah.
hey, you're the ones that put him in office, or him or her in
Yep.
office,
Yep.
right? Regardless of why. So yeah.
Yep.
Hey, I want to wrap up this episode. We're gonna this is gonna be a couple part one, but we're gonna get into a lot of current topics and things on the other one. But one thing, like I talked about, we've talked to a lot of vets that have went to become politicians or tried to or have, and that kind of stuff. You talked about this character, you talked about this humility, and people stepping up to serve. Obviously, that's not exclusive to vets, because there are good character vets and bad character vets. But
Yep.
what are your thoughts on veterans who, we see a lot of we call entrepreneurs that go out and start businesses, but what are your thoughts on veterans that are stepping up, trying to give back and do that kind of thing? You think that's a calling or something that vets should look to,
Yeah.
or just if they feel led to?
Yeah, I think it's amazing. I think more vets should. I think because they know about discipline, they have focus. I think vets make some of the best entrepreneurs. You look at society back during World War II and before. I mean, a huge portion of the American people had served at one point or another.
Right.
I think we need more of that. So the answer is yes. I think every vet should try to open a business or try to find ways to excel and advance in industry. I think it's great because they have the right mindset, the right experience, and they know exactly what they fought for.
Good. Yeah. So that's a good one to wrap up. We're like I say, we're going to do a second part. We're going to talk about your term limit pledge and a number of topics. But for now, thank you so much, Cameron, for joining me. Thank you for coming on. This was a great episode. I think hopefully this is one where a lot of people get to know you. And where people that are interested learn more about you, donate to your campaign, where can they find all that at?
So you can go to my website at CameronHamilton.com, CAMERON, Hamilton, HAMILTON. There, what I would ask people to do is there's a 4-minute video. It's an intro of who I am, why I'm running, and you can meet my family in that video. That's what I would ask people to do. Go to my website, watch my campaign video, and then decide, am I someone that you'd like to partner with? Am I someone that you'd like to support? Because ultimately, This is a job interview for me. That's the way I call it. I'm trying to work for you.
Right. Awesome. So CameronHamilton.com. We'll definitely put that on our socials and get that out there. Again, want to thank you so much for giving me some of your time. And thank you to all of our listeners and viewers for tuning in, and stay tuned for part 2 coming up tomorrow. Thank you very much. Cameron, have a good one.
Thank you, brother.
Well, that wraps up another episode of the Stu and the Nunn Show, and we hope you had as much fun listening to it as we did hosting it for you. Don't forget to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter. You can find all these links at stewandthenunn.com. We will talk to you again next Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Central. Also, we'd like to thank our sponsors, Commodity Outdoors, Veteran Outdoors, and listen.